When kingdoms fell, kings met the sword and their bloodlines should have ended there. But for their daughters, the story was far darker. The Ottomans did not grant them the mercy of death. They turned them into living tools of conquest, stripping away their names, their faith, and their memories until even they could no longer recognize themselves. These women were not merely prisoners. They were the empire's strategy, its psychological weapon, its method of erasing dynasties without spilling another drop of blood. Death was final. What awaited them was unending, and it was worse than death. When kingdoms fell to the Ottomans, the fate of ruling families followed a pattern that was both predictable and cruel. Male members of defeated dynasties, whether princes, generals, or nobles, were usually executed without delay. Their deaths served a political purpose, removing immediate threats to Ottoman authority and ensuring no rival claimant could gather support. For the men, this violent end was decisive, leaving little room for resistance or future ambition. The paradox appeared in how the empire treated the daughters of those same dynasties. Unlike their brothers and fathers, the women were deliberately kept alive, not out of mercy but because they held a different value. Their bodies, their lineage, and their symbolic role as heirs of once powerful families made them more useful than the men who had been cut down. Execution ended a bloodline. But the Ottomans had a far more lasting method of erasing dynasties, and it began with the daughters. Royal daughters were never seen as ordinary captives. They represented dynasties that had once held power, and their presence reminded subjects of the legitimacy of fallen rulers. For this reason, they carried symbolic weight far beyond their own lives. By taking control of such women, the Ottomans demonstrated that no bloodline was safe, not even those thought to be divinely chosen. Unlike common prisoners of war, who were valued for labor or immediate economic gain, noble daughters could be turned into political assets. Their forced conversion and assimilation into Ottoman society sent a public message to defeated populations that resistance was hopeless. Each captured princess stood as proof that even the most prestigious families could be broken and absorbed. This made them valuable not only for their beauty or skills, but also for the psychological effect their captivity produced. To the Ottomans, royal women were not just captives, they were the blueprint for dismantling an empire from within. The capture of royal daughters was not left to chance or the chaos of battle. Ottoman campaigns often included explicit orders for commanders to identify and secure women of dynastic blood. Chronicles and administrative notes reveal that such captives were treated as strategic assets, listed alongside treasures, land, and fortresses in the record of spoils. This shows that the process was not an accidental outcome of victory but a deliberate policy woven into military planning. The value placed on these women was understood at every level of command, making their capture a recognized objective rather than a side effect of conquest. Once taken, they were delivered to centers of power where officials assumed responsibility for their processing. This structured system underscores how deeply the empire prioritized the control of dynastic women as part of its expansion strategy. But once seized, their journey didn't end on the battlefield. It only began. Once royal daughters were brought under Ottoman control, they entered a system designed to manage them with precision. Palaces and harems functioned not only as places of residence but as institutions where new captives were processed and categorized. Officials recorded their origins, family ties, and physical traits in the same way that merchants noted the details of goods. This bureaucratic handling stripped the women of their former status, reducing them to entries in registers and items in ledgers. The empire maintained an organized intake procedure that ensured no captive, especially of noble birth, would be lost or overlooked. From the outside, it resembled an efficient administrative process, but for the women it meant their humanity was reduced to paperwork. They were no longer daughters of kings but assets of the empire. Yet categorizing them as property was only the first step. The real transformation came later. For the captured daughters of defeated kings, the next stage was the systematic erasure of identity. The first measure was often a forced name change, replacing dynastic titles with Ottoman or Islamic names chosen by their new masters. This symbolic act broke the link to their families and erased the public memory of who they once were. Language restrictions followed, as they were required to abandon their native tongues and communicate only in Turkish or Arabic. Over time, the enforced silence of their own languages cut off the possibility of preserving songs, stories, or prayers tied to their heritage. Religion was another target, with conversion ceremonies severing their spiritual connection to the faith in which they were raised. These steps were not random. They were calculated to destroy cultural memory and prevent even the hope of return. When a princess could no longer remember her own name, the Ottomans considered the process successful, but this was only the foundation. The stage after identity erasure was training for submission. Captured daughters were placed in controlled environments where they were taught Ottoman customs, daily rituals, and courtly manners. They learned music, poetry, and refined gestures that reflected the culture of their captors. On the surface, this resembled an education, but its real purpose was to reprogram them into compliant subjects of the empire. At the core of this training was preparation for sexual servitude. Women once raised to negotiate alliances or uphold dynastic honor were now instructed in practices that stripped them of dignity and redirected their value toward pleasing their masters. Every lesson reinforced the idea that their worth lay not in their bloodline or upbringing, but in their ability to entertain and obey. Some adapted to survive. Some resisted, only to face harsher treatment. But in both cases, the empire extracted value. Despite the strict systems of control, some princesses attempted resistance. A few tried to escape, relying on loyal servants or hidden routes, but almost all were caught. Others refused to comply with training or clung to their faith, acts that were met with severe beatings or starvation. Some chose suicide, seeing death as the only escape from the life imposed on them. The Ottomans used these attempts as warnings. Public punishments were staged so that other captives could witness the consequences of defiance. A single failed escape could lead to executions or lifelong confinement, turning resistance into a lesson of fear. The message was clear. Rebellion was useless, survival depended on submission. Resistance rarely survived, but for those who endured, a new and equally devastating stage awaited. For a small number of captive princesses, survival and obedience led to what the Ottomans called advancement. These women, considered successful in their training, could rise in status within the harem and even gain influence in elite households. Yet this success carried its own cost. Their highest role was to bear children for Ottoman rulers or officials, turning their wombs into instruments of empire. The children born of these unions symbolized the strategic absorption of conquered dynasties. A royal bloodline that once carried the authority of Christendom was now redirected into the lineage of the empire that had destroyed it. To Ottoman administrators, this was a triumph, the blending of conquered prestige into their own. But for the women themselves, it was the final betrayal, as the blood of their ancestors became proof of their subjugation. In the Ottomans' view, this was victory, but to the captured daughters, it was the final betrayal. The capture of royal daughters was never only about controlling individuals. It was part of a wider strategy to break dynasties themselves. By removing princesses from their families, the Ottomans erased the possibility of marriage alliances that could revive fallen kingdoms. Sisters were deliberately separated, scattered across different regions, ensuring no unity or mutual support. This dispersal dissolved dynastic strength and made recovery impossible. Without their daughters, noble families lost not only heirs but also the symbols around which resistance could form. The method was deliberate: isolate, erase, and absorb until no Christian dynasty could return to power. It wasn't just about enslaving bodies, it was about dismantling entire cultures. The empire managed captured princesses with the same precision it applied to taxes or military supplies. Detailed records listed their ages, origins, and physical features, reducing human beings to entries in ledgers. Markets placed valuations on them, with daughters of kings and nobles commanding the highest prices. Over time, genealogical tracking was introduced to monitor children born from these women, ensuring that royal bloodlines were absorbed into Ottoman lineages. This bureaucracy stripped away individuality and treated lives as assets to be catalogued, transferred, and consumed. Yet the true horror was not only in the documents, it was in how completely society normalized this system. News of captured princesses spread quickly across Christian courts, carried by diplomats, merchants, and survivors. Each story served as a warning that no dynasty, however proud, was safe from humiliation. The knowledge that royal daughters could be taken, converted, and erased from memory demoralized entire populations. Resistance weakened not only from military fear but from the dread of what awaited their noblest women. Christian rulers understood that their deaths would end their rule, but the capture of their daughters would stain their legacies forever. This fear paralyzed decision-making and undermined unity against the empire. When kings feared their daughters' fates more than their own deaths, Ottoman strategy was complete. Contemporaries who witnessed these events often remarked that the fate of captured princesses was worse than death. Execution, though brutal, ended suffering with finality. Enslavement, however, stretched the loss across years, reshaping identities until little of the person remained. These women were forced to abandon their names, their languages, and their faiths. Their bodies were used to bear children who symbolized not continuity of their dynasties, but the triumph of their conquerors. In this way, the Ottomans achieved something that swords alone could never accomplish: the erasure of bloodlines. Whole royal families disappeared, not because every member was killed, but because their daughters were absorbed into a system designed to extinguish the memory of who they once were. The legacy of this practice haunted Christian courts for generations, reminding them that no lineage was untouchable. Death ended a life. What the Ottomans did ended entire bloodlines, and that was the empire's ultimate weapon.